the internet lost its ever-loving mind over a headline that on its own means absolutely nothing. Donna Kelsey, mother of Travis and Jason Kelsey, is renovating her house. Not even a full renovation. She's replacing some windows and doors. And yet this tweet from TMZ racked up millions of views. Major brands jumped in. Travis and Jason and Kylie all responded. It became this whole thing. But why? Why is this a story at all? Because if you remove one detail, Donna Kelsey isn't connected to Taylor Swift, this doesn't exist. There would be no headline, there would be no memes, no viral moments. But add Taylor Swift back in, and suddenly it matters. And this isn't just an isolated incident. This happens to everyone in her orbit, normal, everyday moments. Going to a football game, posting an Instagram story, replacing a few windows and doors, it starts to feel like something more, like clues or lore or a part of this much larger story. And that's exactly how mythology works. Mythology takes ordinary people and events and transforms them into symbols, into characters, into stories that a culture tells about itself. And in the 21st century, one of the most fascinating mythologies being built in real time belongs to Taylor Swift. Because for 2 decades, she hasn't just been writing songs, she's been building a world. And it's a world where the line between author and character and legend gets blurrier with every era. And it's a world that we don't just observe, we participate in it. We are constantly interpreting, adding elements, theorizing, writing the story ourselves. In this episode of the Swiftly Sung Stories podcast, I want to explore the messy mythology of Taylor Swift, how it's created, how it spreads, and why she seems to exist on a narrative plane that almost no other artist ever reaches. Because the truth is, this isn't just a story she tells. It's a story that we're writing too. So what is a myth and what's mythology? Mythology isn't just ancient gods and heroes like you learned in school. It's the stories a culture tells about someone or something until they become larger than life. And we tell these stories and pass them down because they help us understand ourselves and our world. Myths are really maps of meaning for our culture, and mythology is what happens when these stories begin connecting to each other and forming a larger narrative universe. Sometimes myths are born of true stories and then embellished, and sometimes they're just completely made up. But they have this central purpose. They simplify complicated people into symbols. But like a game of telephone, over time, the real person gets overwritten by a character. And this process doesn't just happen to fictional heroes, and it hasn't just happened to Taylor Swift either. We do this all the time to famous people or important people. Marilyn Monroe was just Norma Jean, small-town girl who made it big but paid the price. But today she represents the epitome of Hollywood sex pot glamour. Cleopatra, who was a really brilliant political strategist, is now thought of as this seductress with a cat eye who crumbled an entire empire with her vagina. Elizabeth Taylor, who was incredibly smart and talented in everything she touched, isn't known for her talent. She's known for her number of marriages and her jewelry collection. The real person becomes simplified into one symbolic story, and then the stories tend to become canon whether they're actually true or not. The real person fades, and the symbolic version or character takes their place. Taylor Swift is no longer an ambitious and talented songwriter who took over the pop world. Depending on who's writing the myth, she's many different characters. She's a man-eater. She's spiteful. She's annoying. She's the goat. She's mother. Depending on your feelings toward her and the stories that you've heard, you have a different narrative of Taylor Swift. And that's because the way we mythologize people isn't neutral. We have a gender problem in mythmaking, just like we have a gender problem in society. Men tend to get heroic myths, and women usually get reductive myths. Joseph Campbell, a prolific writer and thinker on mythology, says myths are public dreams, and dreams are private myths. So these myths we tell today about famous people are these public dreams. Myths reveal what a culture collectively imagines. But the collective ideal we have for men versus women is very different, because we live inside the patriarchy. There is no mythologizing a woman without also mythologizing her sexuality, just like with Cleopatra and Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. Mythologizing men looks a lot different. Elvis Presley, who's thought of as the king of rock and roll, this rock god, in reality, he was an addict who married a teenager. We think of Benjamin Franklin as this revolutionary thinker, founding father, who advocated for the abolition of slavery, but in reality, he owned slaves pretty much his entire life. Bill Gates pioneered modern computing as we know it. He does all this philanthropy. He's revolutionized the world. He wants to make the world better. Unfortunately, now we know what he's really like. When it comes to mythologizing complicated men, we usually steer their narrative toward the bold hero. But when it comes to complicated women, we tend to simplify them into these stereotypical archetypes. We omit their best qualities and focus on the trivial ones. We can't just let them be these powerful creatures. They also have to be inherently flawed in some way that men don't have to be. And this has always been the case. What do we say about Eve? That she was the original mother, the first to bring human life into this world? No, we say she bit the apple. Adam, by the way, ate the apple too in this creation myth, but we don't say Adam and Eve ate the apple. We say Eve was tempted because she is the weaker sex. Men are mythologized as powerful. When women are mythologized, we have to explain their power through their sexuality or give another big caveat. She was powerful, but she was also weak or immoral, or insert sin here. So these myths are created and then they spread through our culture until there's kind of one standard story that's written about this person or this character. But Taylor's mythology works a little bit differently because stories are usually written about someone. Cleopatra didn't really tell her own story. We came up with that. More rarely, mythology begins being written by the person themselves. And then as the story enters the public sphere, it evolves into something bigger. This is what happened with Taylor. She started writing her story herself, and she's told it many times through song for nearly 2 decades. But we took these stories and ran with them. We made her this massive cultural character. This doesn't happen with every celebrity or every pop star, so what happened? Here's what's unique. Unlike most artists, Taylor Swift actively constructs her mythology, and she's done it since the very beginning. She is a storyteller first and foremost. She writes stories about herself, and that is how it all started. 20 years ago, this young country artist emerged, telling tales about her own heartbreaks and fears and dreams. She gave us these single stories, the being cheated on in Should Have Said No, or the longing of Teardrops on My Guitar. But then she did something really interesting. She started writing her own lore. From the very beginning of her career, Taylor invited us to construct our own stories about her by leveraging our curiosity. She did and still does this in a couple of ways. First is using this diaristic style of songwriting. She writes songs about her own life. But the line between fact and fiction is blurred because we're not seeing ring camera footage of the breakup itself. We're hearing the author's interpretation of that event. So the messy line between truth and fiction invites our curiosity, and it leaves room for us to add our own interpretations and speculate, and we do. The second is by using Easter eggs. In the liner notes in her very first album, she spelled out secret messages. For Teardrops on My Guitar, it was "He Will Never Know." For Should Have Said No, it was just the name Sam repeated 6 times, spelling out the name of the person who allegedly cheated on her. This was an invitation to decode those narratives, and it expanded her universe beyond these single stories. It made us curious about the real stories behind the songs, and it also added this layer of myth-making and secrecy. She let us know that there was more to the story, and so we were eager to find out what it was. Because as curious humans, someone tells you, I have a secret, we are dying to know what it is. But third, and a key part of how she built an entire mythology, it isn't what she does give us, it's what she doesn't give us. She knows that the greatest of luxuries is your secrets. She knows we will try to connect the dots, even if she hints that there are dots to be connected. So she tells stories in a specific way to make us curious, but that alone is not how mythology is built. We are the ones who take these stories and build an entire world of lore around them. So let's look at a specific example of how this happens. One of Taylor's more recent myths is that she was in a short-lived relationship with Maddie Healy that broke her heart. We don't know how explicitly true this is because she never told us verbatim, I am dating Maddie Healy and he broke my heart. But we saw photos of them together. They seemingly mouthed these dedications to one another on stage. And this became part of her story. But then this single myth, Taylor and Maddie sitting in a tree, DYING, this exploded into an entire mythology after Taylor released the Tortured Poets Department. Suddenly, it wasn't just one myth, one story. It was 31 of them, all of these different emotions and perspectives. And because of the single story we had before, we began to build this massive mythology around this relationship. After TTPD came out, Swiftie started looking back and connecting the dots, and whether rightly or wrongly, came to the conclusion that this was a 10-year situationship full of longing and misconnections. We assumed that this secret love that Taylor had been singing about for ages was about this one person. The mythology we built between reading through the lines of TTPD and her very theatrical performance on the Eras Tour, we looked back at past lyrics, we expanded this single myth into an entire world and added to all the other stories. We end up turning her not just into this heartbroken woman done dirty by Maddie Healy. We turn her into this heartbroken heroine who can never find a real partner who will stand beside her. And then when she finally does find it, it feels like a victory for all of us. This is how single myths in Taylor's story and in her storytelling come to exist in this mythological universe. One myth appears, we analyze it, new stories grow from it, and then eventually this whole narrative forms that becomes a part of the zeitgeist. But part of what makes Taylor's mythology so powerful is that it doesn't exist in isolated pieces. It exists as a multiverse. Her songs, her albums, her eras, they don't feel separate. They feel connected. Like they're all fragments of a much larger narrative written by the same mind, circling the same ideas just from different angles. And over time, that creates something massive, a narrative universe where everything can connect, even if it wasn't originally meant to. It's not unlike the Marvel cinematic universe. There are these recurring symbols and characters and emotional arcs that tend to show up again and again. Sometimes those connections are intentional. And the clearest example of this in Taylor's world is the folklore or love triangle. Cardigan, August, and Betty. That's explicit. She tells us that those songs are connected. But other times the connections are much looser, and that's where things get really interesting. Because Taylor also builds this multiverse through recurring metaphors and symbolism. One of the clearest examples is color. We already associate each album with color, but she also uses color symbolically inside the lyrics themselves. And over time, those meanings start to evolve. Like, take the color red. In red, it's passion and intensity. Loving him was red. But even earlier in Love Story, she uses a different meaning. You were Romeo, I was a scarlet letter. Now we're in a completely different space. The scarlet letter isn't romance, it's shame. It's being marked, being judged. She returns to that idea again in New Romantics. We show off our different scarlet letters. Same color family, completely different meaning. And then as she goes on, this color keeps darkening. In I Did Something Bad, it's crimson red paint on my lips. She's the witch. She's being cast as the villain. By the time we get to maroon, the color has shifted again. The mark they saw on my collarbones, so scarlet it was maroon. Red has become something you can't wash out, something that stains your soul long after a relationship ends. And later, she'll make that connection explicit. Will that make your memory fade from this scarlet maroon? Like she says in Chloe or Sam or Sophia or Marcus. So across her work, these symbols repeat and evolve and deepen. And whether or not every connection is intentional, the pattern is there. And that's really where mythology starts to take shape. Because once you notice a pattern, you start looking for more. You start connecting songs across albums, across eras, and sometimes you start connecting them to real people. We see a new lyric, we attach it to a relationship, and then we go back retroactively trying to map out that same meaning onto older songs. So suddenly a color like maroon doesn't just represent a feeling, it represents a person or a timeline. It's a hidden narrative that we're trying to piece together. And this is the key shift. We stop treating songs like stories and start treating them like evidence. But the truth is, these are still songs. They're still crafted intentionally with very purposeful use of literary devices like metaphors and symbolism and recurring imagery. And when the same writer is creating work over 2 decades, there are going to be patterns, but not everything is a clue. Sometimes it's just a style. But since Taylor has trained us to look for deeper meaning, we look. And when we don't find a connection, we tend to just create one. And that's how the multiverse becomes a mythology. Not just because Taylor built a world, but because we keep expanding it and connect the dots. We fill in the gaps. We write meaning into the margins. And over time, that creates a version of Taylor Swift that isn't just an artist, but a character. And sometimes one that is so powerful that it starts to overshadow the real person at the center of it. Though it's really fun to exist in the multiverse and look for meaning, Taylor's mythology isn't always a good thing, because sometimes her mythology runs away from her and grows so large that she can no longer control it. Here's where it gets really messy, because each of us can write our own narratives about who she is, and that can stick whether we have evidence for it or not. The first time this really affected Taylor in a big way was in the Red Era, though it was happening much earlier than that. There was already this narrative that she was this boy crazy girl who will date you and break up with you, then write a scathing breakup song, and then move on to the next target. But when she came out with Red, it really went up a notch, the slut shaming, because she was writing about heartbreak so viscerally and with so much detail. She later told us in the 1989 Taylor's Version prologue, "I had become the target of slut shaming, the intensity and relentlessness of which would be criticized and called out if it happened today. The jokes about my amount of boyfriends, the trivialization of my songwriting as if it were a predatory act of a boy-crazed psychopath, the media co-signing of this narrative. I had to make it stop because it was really starting to hurt." Notice she said narrative. What she's talking about is a myth that she no longer has control over. Because of the gender bias in mythmaking, they couldn't let her just be this powerful artist with a sharp pen. They had to explain that power away by using her sexuality. So the narrative was, she's a slut. And she's successful because she's a slut, because all of her #1 songs are written from her experience as a slut. That was the myth that started around this time. And it started with her songs, then it exploded into this monster story that she had no control over. But then she tried to rein it back in. Being a consummate optimist, she says, "I assumed I could fix this if I simply changed my behavior. I swore off dating and decided to focus only on myself, my music, my growth, and my female friendships." The problem, and why Taylor couldn't escape the slut shaming, is because you can't outrun the very reason these stories exist in the first place. So what happened next was a new mythology formed because she was trying to rewrite the narrative. And this one didn't go her way either, because around this time is when the Gaylor mythology really begins. If you're not aware of the Gaylors, this is a subsect of the Swiftie community that believes that Taylor is a closeted lesbian. And it sprung up because she was running away from this boy-crazy, man-eater narrative. Taylor said, "If I only hung out with my female friends, people couldn't sensationalize or sexualize that, right? I would learn later on that people could and people would." No hate to any of the Gaylors. This is just another example of how Taylor shows us something, anything, lyrics in a song, dating a boy, hanging out with friends, and we begin to write this lore surrounding it. Add the media to this narrative, who are trying to sell clicks, social media accounts who are trying to get likes, and it can morph into this myth that overtakes Taylor's own self-written narrative. This is also how conspiracy theories work, by the way, because conspiracy theories are just mythologizing real events and twisting them to mean something else, something larger. We want something to have more meaning than it does on the surface, and in Taylor's world, we often mythologize her romantic relationships because we think that when Taylor writes about her romances, there's some larger truth to find, even if it's not our truth to find. And if we connect enough dots, we think we'll find out what really happened, not just what she told us has happened. We rewrite her relationships to fit the narrative that makes sense to us, the story that we want to believe. And one of these narratives that we wrote is that Joe Alwyn is a sad sack who did nothing but weigh her down. But she never told us that. So where did that story come from? Let's retrace our steps and look at the reality of what we actually know about this relationship. They met in Taylor's 1989 era. They holed up together in London during her year of seclusion. They were intensely private. Joe wrote parts of songs from Folklore, and during the first part of the Eras tour, they broke up. The rest is all speculation. We don't actually know much about Joe because he only talks about his professional life in interviews. So where did the story begin that he's this depressed, morose, sad sack? A lot of it is just the vibes we get from Joe, but there are also these famous snapshots of the two of them together, of which there are only a few because they were very private. But we read into these images and videos. We look into this split second where Taylor looks sad and he looks annoyed by the attention. And remember, these images are used to sell clicks, to sell advertising. So they're meant to be provocative. They're not meant to depict the truth. But we read into these visuals. And then there are also some clues in Taylor's lyrics that we could also read into, and maybe too much. In Peace, she says, "But I'm a fire, I will keep your brittle heart warm if your Cascade ocean blue waves come." So she's seemingly referencing this sort of delicate nature that leans toward depression. In You're Losing Me, we got the feeling that he was kind of unresponsive. Do something, babe, say something. You're losing me. And then after they broke up, in How Did It End, she says, he was a hothouse flower to my outdoorsman. And if we already have the assumption that he has this brittle heart or that he's this delicate, depressed flower, this metaphor confirms what we already think we know. But when we read into these songs as if they are a letter written directly to him or written directly about him, and no one or nothing else, we are writing our own stories about these stories. And none of these assumptions are based on fact. We're assuming that these songs are about him when we don't even know that for sure. In reality, we don't know much about this relationship at all, and we don't know much about him. But we've created this entire mythology around this relationship. We are the ones who have written that story with Joe as this depressive character. Is it true? We don't know. I mean, the rock in the Opalite music video didn't help. But at any rate, we don't know for sure. We're just making up stories based on Taylor's stories. But now it's written into her mythology. She was unhappy in this relationship for years with a partner who wanted to just keep her all to himself. She felt tied down. Then when she got out of this relationship, she ran straight into a new one that was exciting and hot and then blew up in her face. And now she's found the one. It's this myth where she had to kiss a lot of frogs to find her prince, but it's all an invention based on scattered clues that might not even be clues to begin with. We wrote that story. She gave us the source material, but we're the ones who put all the pieces together, whether they actually fit or not. And we do it. We turn her into this heartbroken heroine who finally found true love because we want it desperately to be true. Because if it's true for Taylor, it could happen for us. Mythology exists to help us make meaning of our lives. But when we rewrite her relationships, we're simply writing our own narrative about Taylor. And there's a couple problems with this whole setup. The first is that we're trying to tell a story of the artist through interpreting the art, but art isn't fact. Lyrics aren't an autobiography. The purpose of art is expression, not reporting. Especially with Taylor, we treat her lyrics like they're her private diary, but they're not. They're carefully crafted pieces of art, curated purposefully, and intended for a huge audience and intended to be relatable. And the second problem is that we treat emotional truth as literal truth. Like, think of the scarf in All Too Well. That's a literary symbol that means whatever you think it means. It's not a literal scarf. It's a device that she has used to tell this emotional story. But then we start treating it as a literal scarf. Is it really at his sister's house? And then we attribute all of these qualities of the character in song to a real person. But when we treat the scarf as a literal scarf and try to transpose this symbolic imagery onto a real life relationship, we're rewriting a story that's already been written. And this is a particular problem unique to Swifties. We blur the line between the art and the artist, between what's real and what's storytelling. We almost forget that these are stories, and we tend to assume that she's always writing the truth, writing about real lived experiences, and we assume that she is reporting those experiences to us truthfully. She might do this sometimes, and she might not. But when we barge ahead, assuming that the characters in her songs are based on real people and real events in her real life, we are rewriting the story. We start writing the mythology of Taylor Swift ourselves. And in the end, it can bear little resemblance to the story she's actually told, which means something really fascinating happens. The mythology of Taylor Swift is now partly written by people who aren't Taylor Swift. Her fans have become co-authors of this myth, and sometimes we're just making stuff up with no evidence at all, but it still becomes a part of the story. One really interesting example of this is the 5 holes in the fence that happened during the lead up to the Lover era. Taylor posted this picture in which she was looking through a lattice fence because she does tend to drop cryptic clues like this, especially on social media. And because of the previous photos in this carousel, you could read into them. It could have signaled a countdown, but the internet went wild for this. What was the significance of 5? Was something coming in 5 days? Or are there going to be 5 singles, 5 music videos, something else coming on the 5th? We went crazy trying to figure out what it meant. As it turns out, it meant nothing. And in any other artist universe, this would have been just another social media post. Just like Donna Kelsey's home renovations could have been just another TMZ tweet. But Swifties melted down over a clue that wasn't even a clue. It was just an artistic marketing image. Later in the Lover rollout, Taylor posted the cheeky caption, "Now there are 5 holes in the fence," teasing that the "You Need to Calm Down" music video would indeed come in 5 days. That caption told us, you're doing too much. That image initially didn't mean anything. You guys are the ones who wrote this story. But because she's trained us to look for clues everywhere, everything can be a clue. And now this whole incident, the 5 holes in the fence, is written into the mythology of Taylor Swift. She didn't write that story, we did. And now 5 holes in the fence is kind of shorthand for like, you need to stop clowning, you need to calm down. Not everything is that deep. But here is the Easter egg paradox. Once we're trained to look for meaning everywhere, we start finding meaning even where none exists. Swifties have this Pavlovian response to start decoding, and suddenly everything becomes an Easter egg, even if it wasn't one when the author put it out into the world. A color becomes a theory, a lyric becomes evidence for anything you want to believe, and coincidence becomes canon. The mythology expands far beyond what Taylor herself actually wrote. But why do we do this when statistically only a tiny portion of things are actually clues? Yes, it's fun. Yes, we think we might get an imaginary crown if we get it right. But we also think that if we connect the puzzle pieces, we'll unlock some hidden secret about Taylor. We'll suddenly understand it all, and we'll understand her, and therefore we'll understand ourselves. And that is why mythology exists in the first place, to give our world meaning. Our clowning, in other words, is mythologizing Taylor Swift. That's what we're doing. But the most fascinating part of all of this for me is that when we mythologize Taylor, we're doing exactly that. We're myth-making. We're creating a character. We don't know her. She's not our friend. We only see what she chooses to show us, and the rest is written by us. And the characters in her multiverse, whether they're based on real people or not, we don't know them either. We only know the stories that she writes and the meaning that we assign to them. And this is one of the strangest and most unique things about Taylor's mythology. She exists in 2 roles in the same time. She is both the author writing the story and the character inside the story that the author is writing about. Most artists only occupy one of those roles. Novelists write characters, actors play characters. But Taylor Swift writes and performs songs about Taylor Swift. And because she exists both as this mythical creature and as a human, both the showgirl and the girl, we don't know what's true and what's just part of the story. And this causes something really interesting to happen. There is a split or a fracture. There's Taylor Swift, human girl, and then there is the character of Taylor Swift, the showgirl, who is mega famous and glamorous and occupies this huge place in the cultural zeitgeist. And then there's just the girl who writes the stories. Her identity has fractured into 2 parts, Taylor Swift the human and Taylor Swift the cultural character. The human exists in the stories that she writes, the art that she creates, and in the real life that she lives. But the character exists in headlines and in fan theories and in these cultural narratives, these stories we tell about her. This is definitely something she feels because she's written a lot of songs about this identity split. She wrote Antihero about how her persona is so much bigger than herself. She wrote Mirrorball about being a human inside of this big cultural machine. The manuscript and Dear Reader are about the stories that she tells us versus the stories we tell about her. And she recently wrote an entire album about it, The Life of a Showgirl. And in the title track, she tells us directly, you will have to sell your soul. You will have your identity fractured when you become this mythic figure. But while it plagues her, this mythology is part of what makes her so successful and so massive, and she knows it. Sometimes it's her Achilles heel, but it also serves just to make her more and more popular. And in recent years, it's gotten so large and complex that every story she tells and every story we tell about her, it blurs the line between fact, interpretation, and legend. But here's the really messy part. Once the myth enters the public imagination, the person at the center can't fully control it anymore. We continue writing these stories about Taylor until she becomes larger than life, larger than the single human woman, Taylor Swift. She can no longer control it as hard as she tries. The stories take on a life of their own. And Taylor herself has acknowledged that this is something she's aware of, and it's something that plagues her. In the 4th prologue poem, In the Life of a Showgirl, she says, you live by a strict code. Never believe your own mythology. Never type your name into the search bar. Let the wolves howl all they want. The moon should never howl back. What she's saying is this thing has become so oversized and so overwhelming that my mythology has become bigger than me. I might be the figure at the center, the moon, but I have no idea how to make the wolves stop howling. Her orbit, her gravitational pull has become so strong that everything and everyone that surrounds her becomes part of the story, even if it's her future mother-in-law doing some simple home improvement. So you can be this mythic character, but it comes with a cost and consequences. And the first of these is that people expect the character, not the human. The public wants Taylor Swift to behave like Taylor Swift Inc., the person they understand. If she changes, if she deviates, the mythology resists it. We saw this in real time when Taylor started dating Maddie Healy. There was this huge uproar amongst part of the Swifties because Maddie is also kind of this mythological figure, but not in the charming, good way that Taylor is. He's the archetype of bad boy, doesn't know when to shut up, and he's provocative. It seems just to be provocative. We thought, oh God, is this who she really is? It shakes Taylor's mythology, the story we know, to the core, so we push back. There was that infamous open letter from the fans essentially telling her to not date Maddie Healy or else we would no longer be fans. This was a battle of Taylor's mythology. Out here, this nebulous entity that is so much bigger than her, in direct conflict with Taylor Swift, human woman. They were trying to control Taylor Swift, the character, without considering that there is a human person underneath that character. And we don't know who that human person is. We have clues, but we don't know her. And the second way that this mythology becomes a curse is that stories stick and become part of the narrative even when they're wrong. The slut-shaming narrative is a prime example. Certain narratives about her career or relationship become permanent cultural shorthand, whether they're accurate or not. And the third curse is that the myth becomes a headline. Sometimes the stories about Taylor overshadows the art that she's creating. And the entire 1989 era is a great example of this. She had come out with this incredible album. It would sweep the Grammys, all of the awards. But the headlines were nothing to do with the art. The headlines were about her partying in New York and speculation about who she was dating. And it still happens today. So 20 years into her career, Taylor Swift isn't just a singer or songwriter anymore. She's a character inside a cultural mythology, and one that isn't only written by her, it's written by all of us. Because when we listen to her music, we're not just hearing songs. We are watching a writer shape and reshape her own story in real time. That creates tension at the center of everything she does. So when Taylor tells us a story about herself, is it the truth? Or is it a myth in the making? And maybe the answer is it's both, because we don't just hear her lyrics, we interpret them, we connect them, we build narratives around them. And over time, those interpretations become part of the story itself. So maybe the mythology doesn't just surround the music, maybe it is the music. And that's why it's so compelling, why people keep coming back, album after album, era after era. It's this analysis, theorizing, trying to piece it all together, because it doesn't feel like we're just listening to her story. Maybe the real magic of Taylor Swift isn't that she writes songs about her life. It's that she's created a mythology where millions of people feel like they're living inside the story with her. And since the mythology of Taylor is still being written, every listener who interprets a lyric, shares a theory, tells a story about her, becomes part of the myth too. It feels like we're inside it and we are active participants in writing it. And the most fascinating part is the story isn't finished yet. As she told us, the story isn't mine anymore. Thank you for joining me here at Swiftly Sung Stories. If you enjoyed this deep dive / video essay, please like and subscribe on YouTube or on your favorite podcast app. If you have a topic you'd like me to cover, you can contact me through my website, swiftlySungStories.com, linked in the show notes. And over there, you can also find lyric quizzes, analysis of over 250 songs, and a whole lot more cool stuff. You can also message me on TikTok or Instagram and let me know what you want to see next. Thank you for spending your time with me, and I will see you in the next episode.